On 6 July 1945, in a quiet operations room near Frankfurt, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over casualty charts, listening to pencils scratch. The numbers spoke softly yet brutally. Divisions hollowed, regiments skeletal. Germany bleeding men faster than factories could replace. Eisenhower thought of American boys crossing oceans, mothers reading telegrams, and an enemy collapsing through exhaustion rather than mercy. In those moments his staff recalled earlier briefings, intercepted German reports, and prisoner interviews that told the same story. Across the table General Omar Bradley watched silently, fingers stained with ink, eyes fixed on a map stripped of units. Bradley had fought since Normandy, seen courage burn bright, and now sensed victory paid in invisible graves. Reports from Cologne and the Ruhr arrived hourly. Each line thinner, each unit younger, each surrender easier. American generals were not celebrating yet. They were measuring cost, imagining aftermaths, and weighing how collapse would reshape Europe. Only months earlier on, March 1945, during the Rhine crossings, commanders expected ferocity not vacancy. Now German battalions surrendered in clusters. Teenagers and old men mixed, fear louder than ideology. These generals had studied attrition for years, yet seeing it embodied in faces, columns, and empty barracks shocked them. Captured ledgers showed losses untrained replaced. Morale shredded steadily, and command structures cracking under absence. Eisenhower understood manpower was destiny. Tanks without crews were statues, and wars ended when societies emptied. Bradley murmured that numbers end wars. Eisenhower nodded slowly, both men aware. Mercy followed exhaustion. He imagined Washington listening closely, allies calculating borders, and soldiers praying the end would hold. Outside trucks rolled eastward. Prisoners shuffled quietly, and the war felt suddenly older. This realization would guide American decisions, temper triumphal speeches, and frame how peace would be enforced. What they said next would echo across commands, influence surrender terms, and define how victory was remembered. As night settled over Frankfurt, the room stayed awake. Charts whispering surrender, history bending towards silence. By dawn on 8 July 1945, Eisenhower convened his senior commanders. Coffee cold, voices lower than usual. The room carried news from Bavaria, Saxony, and the shattered East, each report confirming Germany's veins were emptying. General George Marshall, joining via secure line from Washington, listened carefully, weighing manpower as strategy, not statistics. American generals spoke of Volkssturm units, gray hair beside trembling youth, rifles older than their holders. Bradley recalled interrogations near Kassel, prisoners admitting they marched without replacements promised, knowing promises were lies. General Patton, blunt as ever, called it collapse by starvation of men, not defeat of will. Yet beneath Patton's bravado, there was respect for an enemy bled dry by its own ambition. They discussed, April 1945, reports from Leipzig. Units reduced to platoons, officers commanding ghosts. Maps showed arrows pushing east, but also silence behind them. No counterattacks, no reserves waiting. Eisenhower stressed restraint, warning that desperation breeds cruelty, and hollow armies can still kill. Marshall agreed, noting how manpower collapse invited chaos, refugees, reprisals, and political vacuum. The generals remembered, June 1941. Germany surging with endless divisions, confidence roaring through radios. Now radios crackled with surrender pleas, fragmented commands, and commanders asking permission to stop fighting. Bradley observed this was not just military defeat. It was societal exhaustion spilling into uniforms. American intelligence estimated millions lost. Factories silent, training fields empty. Future generations erased. These assessments shaped orders. Slower advances, tighter discipline. Preparation for occupation rather than pursuit. Eisenhower spoke quietly of responsibility. victory without vengeance, order over spectacle. He knew history would judge how power treated weakness, especially one born of mass death. As the meeting ended, each general carried the same weight. Triumph tempered by ruin witnessed. Outside, German civilians watched American convoys pass, sensing the war's end not as celebration, but absence. The manpower collapse was no abstraction now. It breathed, surrendered, and waited for judgment. On 10 July 1945, General Eisenhower reviewed fresh intelligence from southern Germany, the tone darker than before. These were not battlefield updates, they were autopsies of an army already dead. American officers walking through former Wehrmacht depots near Munich found uniforms stacked without bodies to fill them. Bradley described silent training grounds. Boots lined neatly, rifles oiled. No recruits arriving. The German state had planned for years. Yet manpower had vanished faster than ideology could replace. General Marshall warned that such collapse did not end danger, it transformed it. Disbanded soldiers drifted home armed with despair. Cities swelled with widows, and anger searched for direction. Eisenhower recalled, February 1943, after Stalingrad, when Germany still believed recovery was possible. Now recovery was myth, birth rates shattered, fathers buried, sons already gone. American generals debated occupation strength. Knowing empty armies did not mean empty resistance. Reports from the Black Forest mentioned isolated holdouts. Not units, but men refusing surrender out of loss. Patton argued speed mattered less now, control mattered more, discipline over drama. Bradley agreed, noting that manpower collapse invited insurgency, not counteroffensives. They discussed how Germany had consumed its future, drafting children, stripping farms, hollowing families. One intelligence officer read a captured letter. A German lieutenant apologizing to his mother for existing. Silence followed, heavy, unmilitary, human. Eisenhower spoke then, softly, saying wars end when societies cannot bear funerals anymore. He reminded them America must not confuse victory with moral escape. What Germany lost could not be rebuilt by borders alone, generations were missing. Outside headquarters civilians scavenged bricks, not for homes, but for graves. The generals sensed history shifting from battles to burdens, from commands to consequences. Their words now would shape policy, memory, and whether peace endured beyond paper. Germany's manpower hemorrhage was complete. Yet its meaning was still unfolding. As night fell, Eisenhower wrote notes for Washington. Careful, measured, aware of gravity. On 13 July 1945, Eisenhower stood beside General Lucius Clay in Berlin's outskirts. Rubble stretching to the horizon. This was no battlefield, it was the evidence of manpower spent. Streets emptied of working men. Clay spoke of administration, food, and order. Yet Eisenhower watched faces. Women everywhere, men mostly absent. American patrols reported factories intact but silent. Machines waiting for hands that no longer existed. Bradley noted Germany had territory without labor. Cities without fathers, victory without celebration. They remembered intelligence from May 1945. Estimating entire age groups erased between 18 and 30. This absence reshaped strategy more than any remaining German weapon. Eisenhower warned that hunger plus humiliation could radicalize survivors, even after surrender. Clay agreed, saying manpower collapse demanded stability, not punishment theatrics. American generals debated demobilization speeds, occupation troop numbers, and reconstruction priorities. They knew empty nations breed resentment faster than armies breed war. Patton, touring Bavaria earlier, remarked that defeated soldiers wanted food, not flags. Bradley echoed that despair was the new enemy, not divisions. Captured German administrators admitted the state had lost control months before capitulation. Even orders to surrender came late, communication dying with commanders. Eisenhower reflected on September 1939, when Germany marched unified, confident, and full. Now it stood fractured, hollow, and dependent. He instructed Clay to emphasize order, fairness, and visible restraint. These were not mercies, but necessities born of demographic ruin. American generals understood peace required manpower rebuilding. Families restored, time allowed. Outside Berlin, children scavenged coal. Women queued for water, and silence replaced sirens. Victory tasted ash-like, heavy with responsibility. Germany had bled itself empty, and America now held the fragile remains. The generals knew how they governed this vacuum would define the next war. Or prevent it. On 16 July 1945, news from Potsdam reached Eisenhower's headquarters. Politics now overtaking gunfire. American generals understood manpower collapse shaped diplomacy as much as occupation. Germany arrived at negotiations as a nation without leverage. Its strength already buried. Eisenhower read briefs noting how Soviet commanders spoke openly of empty German ranks. Cities ripe for influence. Bradley worried that desperation could push survivors toward extremism. Any ideology promising dignity. Marshall cautioned Washington that broken populations did not naturally become peaceful ones. The American command reviewed demographic charts. Curves plunging sharply after 1942. Entire villages had lost sons, schools lacked boys, farms lacked labor. This reality forced American generals to reconsider reparations. Punishment versus recovery. Eisenhower argued that stripping more resources from an exhausted people risked repeating history. He remembered November 1918 and the fragile peace that followed. Patton scoffed at leniency publicly, yet privately admitted Germany had no men left to fight. Occupation planners emphasized food shipments, employment, and visible fairness. They believed dignity stabilized faster than fear. Reports from Frankfurt described former soldiers seeking work, not revenge. Bradley noted discipline among surrendering troops improved when treated as humans, not criminals. Eisenhower saw manpower collapse as a moral crossroads. America could govern through strength alone or through example. At Potsdam, the absence of German voices was deafening. They negotiated borders, futures, and consequences without the defeated present. This silence reflected demographic truth. Germany was spoken about, not by. Eisenhower wrote that peace imposed on emptiness must be careful. The war's end revealed victory's hardest task, preventing the next beginning. Outside headquarters, summer passed quietly, without parades, without cheering. The bleeding had stopped, but the wound remained open. On 19 July 1945, Eisenhower received final occupation strength estimates. Thinner than once planned. The assumption was clear: Germany no longer had manpower to resist at scale. American generals debated how absence altered security. Fewer soldiers meant fewer threats, but more instability. Bradley warned that demographic collapse created shadows, not armies, crime. Black markets, resentment. Reports from Hamburg described dockyards intact, yet idle, no crews to load ships. Patton observed bitterly that victory had outrun purpose. Soldiers standing guard over emptiness. Marshall advised caution, noting power vacuums invited influence faster than force. They discussed displaced persons camps, millions moving, few men of fighting age. Eisenhower recalled August 1944, when German counterattacks still surprised Allied planners. Now there were no counterattacks, only surrender forms and hunger lines. Occupation officers noted women carrying industrial labor. Reconstruction resting on broken families. American generals realized rebuilding manpower was generational, not logistical. Food, housing, and security mattered, but time mattered more. Eisenhower stressed restraint in troop behavior. Knowing humiliation compounds loss. Bradley added that respect prevented bitterness from fermenting underground. They reviewed intelligence suggesting former Nazis lacked followers. Not from fear, but from absence. Youth organizations had no youth, militias no men. The ideology had outlived its believers. Eisenhower quietly stated Germany had been defeated twice. Militarily and biologically. No document could restore missing generations. Orders went out emphasizing order, fairness, patience. This was not mercy, it was prevention. Outside American barracks, German civilians watched cautiously. Curiosity mixed with exhaustion. The war was over, but its demographic echo would last decades. The generals felt history shifting beneath their boots. Slower, heavier, irreversible. On 22 July 1945, Eisenhower toured rural Hesse. Far from ruined capitals and flags. Here the manpower collapse felt quieter. Fields untended, tools rusting. Farmhouses run by widows. Local administrators explained harvests failed not from bombs, but missing hands. Bradley noted that armies could be rebuilt faster than societies. American generals observed children working plows, elderly men guiding them slowly. This was the aftermath statistics never showed. Eisenhower remembered briefing rooms where losses were numbers, now they were faces. He spoke with a German woman who said her village had no men under 40. The words stayed with him, heavier than any intelligence report. Patton later remarked that conquest was easy, recovery was unforgiving. American planners adjusted policies, prioritizing agriculture, fuel, and transport. They knew hunger would radicalize faster than speeches. Reports from July 1945 showed crime rising not from ideology, but survival. Eisenhower ordered fair distribution, strict discipline, and visible justice. Bradley emphasized that order without dignity bred resentment. The generals discussed how Germany's manpower bleed altered Europe's balance permanently. France and Britain had scars, but Germany had holes. This absence shifted borders more decisively than treaties. Eisenhower wrote that power now lay with those who could wait. Reconstruction would be slow, uneven, watched by rivals. The American command understood patience was strategy. As they left Hesse, silence followed the convoy. No cheering crowds, no hatred, just tired eyes. The war had ended not with collapse of cities, but of generations. Germany stood defeated in a way armies could never recover from quickly. The generals sensed this was the war's final lesson. On 25 July 1945, Eisenhower received fresh briefings as news from Potsdam hardened into policy. American generals now spoke less of Germany's past, more of Europe's future shaped by absence. The manpower collapse had tilted the continent. Leaving a vacuum power would rush to fill. Marshall warned that demographics decided influence as surely as divisions. Bradley observed that Germany could not balance the Soviet Union without time and stability. Eisenhower understood this silence of men would echo in diplomacy for decades. Reports from the eastern zones described entire towns lacking working-age males. Factories could be rebuilt quickly, families could not. Patton argued that deterrence now depended on Allied unity, not German strength. Occupation officers stressed that humiliation must be avoided. Resentment grows fastest among the empty. Eisenhower reflected on June 1940. When Germany had dictated Europe's fate. Now Germany had no voice, only territory. American generals saw how manpower loss turned a former threat into a responsibility. They discussed long-term security, alliances, and the cost of neglect. Rebuilding trust would outlast rebuilding bridges. Intelligence suggested German civilians were turning inward. Exhausted, distrustful, apolitical. This was not defeatism, it was trauma. Eisenhower instructed commanders to lead visibly, fairly, and predictably. Uncertainty would only deepen wounds. Bradley noted that peace required proof, not promises. American soldiers became symbols of order, restraint, and inevitability. The generals accepted that occupation was now the real campaign. Victory banners mattered less than daily conduct. Germany's manpower collapse had ended the war, but defined the peace. As summer light faded, Eisenhower wrote that strength now meant patience. History, he knew, would judge what followed the silence. On 28 July 1945, Eisenhower reviewed intelligence summaries tracking Europe's shifting balance. The document spoke less of Germany, more of reactions to its emptiness. American generals noted how neighbors recalculated security with Germany no longer a manpower power. Bradley warned that absence invited pressure, not peace. Marshall stressed that stability required Germany functional, not feared. Eisenhower recalled, January 1919. When collapse bred grievance instead of healing. This time, he intended different outcomes. Occupation reports showed cooperation rising where food and work appeared. Former soldiers registered quietly, surrendering weapons without resistance. The war had drained aggression itself. Patton admitted that there was no enemy left to fight, only problems to manage. American commanders debated timelines, knowing impatience could undo victory. Germany's manpower wound was structural, not temporary. Schools reopened without boys. Factories trained women, villages adapted awkwardly. Eisenhower recognized that rebuilding legitimacy mattered more than rebuilding pride. He emphasized transparency, fairness, and restraint in all zones. Bradley noted trust formed slowly among populations with nothing left to lose. Intelligence warned that despair, not ideology, was the greatest threat. The generals shifted from combat leaders to stewards of peace. Their words now shaped daily life for millions. Germany's silence forced others to speak for it. Eisenhower wrote that leadership after victory defined civilization. The war had tested strength, the peace would test character. Outside headquarters, summer storms passed, washing dust from ruins. The guns were silent, but consequences still marched. The manpower collapse had closed one chapter and opened a heavier one. On 31 July 1945, Eisenhower sat alone late. Reviewing notes meant not for generals, but for history. Germany's manpower collapse was no longer intelligence. It was fact embedded in every street. American generals now spoke carefully, aware their words would shape memory. Bradley reflected that wars were won by firepower, but ended by exhaustion. Marshall agreed, saying Germany had not been beaten into peace, but emptied into it. Eisenhower understood this distinction mattered deeply. An enemy destroyed inspires fear, an enemy drained inspires responsibility. Reports showed calm spreading, not from reconciliation, but from lack of strength to resist. Former enemies lined for food under Allied guards, quiet, resigned, human. Patton admitted privately that victory felt hollow without an opponent standing. The American command concluded that Germany's greatest loss was not territory, but generations. This absence would limit ambition, delay recovery, and reshape Europe permanently. Eisenhower wrote that power without men was illusion. He cautioned Washington that peace required patience longer than war required courage. The generals recognized their legacy lay ahead, not behind. How they treated weakness would define American authority. Germany's manpower bleed ended the conflict, but tested the victors. Occupation became stewardship, restraint became strength. Eisenhower closed his notes recalling, April 1945. The last battles, the final deaths. He wrote that the war ended when there were no sons left to send. History would remember flags and dates, but the truth lived in empty homes. American generals had seen victory's true cost, and it sobered them. The silence across Germany was not peace yet, but possibility. What followed would decide if the bleeding ever truly stopped.